History remembers the Minotaur as a monster, but the real story does not begin with horns. It begins with a king's broken oath and a queen's curse that was never hers to bear. Now, let that settle. Let your jaw soften if it feels right. Close your eyes or leave them open. Either way, you are exactly where you need to be. Beneath you, limestone steps of Knossos hold the day's warmth. A wind from the Crete valley carries wild thyme. You stand at the courtyard's edge. The sea through olive trees. You are not here for a monster. You are here for a king who chose pride over sacrifice, a child named for the stars who never saw one, and a princess who risked everything for a crimson thread. So let the path carry you back. Back before the hero. Back before the labyrinth had a name. Chapter 1. The gods looked down. A king chose pride. A queen felt the first strange heat of the curse. The palace of Knossos rose against the Cretan sky, like something the earth had dreamed and then forgotten to bury. Its walls were dressed limestone, pale as bone, catching the early light that spilled across the Masara plain from the east. Red-painted columns stood against the blue morning, their color the deep rust of old offerings. The sea was visible from every terrace. There is no need to picture the place too precisely. It is enough to know that it was beautiful, and that it believed it would last forever. The great courtyard still held the cool of night in its flagstones. Somewhere a fountain ran. The sound of water over worn stone carried through the corridors like a whispered promise. Minos stood on the high terrace above the sea, his back to the throne room, where the double-axe symbols hung in shadow. He was not yet a tyrant. He was a king, waiting for the gods to confirm what he already believed, that he was chosen, that his bloodline was sacred, that the sea itself would yield to his will. The white bowl came from the foam. One moment the sea was empty, a sheet of hammered sapphire stretching toward Thera. The next, the water broke and the beast rose, hide dripping silver, horns sweeping upward like something carved from moonlight, eyes that held no fear of men. It stood on the shoreline, seawater streaming from its flanks, and the Cretan fishermen fell to their knees in the shallows. They had never seen an animal so complete in its stillness, so entirely without hesitation. The bowl did not paw the sand. It simply waited, as if the beach already belonged to it. Poseidon had sent the sign exactly as promised. A beast worthy of sacrifice, the finest bull that would ever walk Cretan earth, offered to the god who commanded the waters that surrounded the island on every side. The pact was ancient and simple. The god gives, the king returns. Nothing in the ritual allowed for negotiation. Minos looked at the bull, and he looked at his herds, the 1,000 cattle that grazed the Masara plain, the breeding lines he had cultivated across 2 decades of careful husbandry. He saw what the bull could become, the foundation of a dynasty written in bloodlines, generations of sacred cattle that would make Knossos untouchable. He ordered his men to drive the bull inland, toward the royal pastures. A lesser animal was led to the altar of Poseidon instead. A fine bull, but ordinary, its horns unremarkable, its hide the common brown of every sacrifice that had come before. The priest said nothing. The knife fell. The smoke rose. And the sea, far below, grew very still. The gods do not always answer betrayal with thunder. Sometimes they answer with silence. For weeks, the palace went about its business. The bull grazed. The queen walked the gardens. The king held court. But Pasiphae had begun to wake in the night, with a heap behind her eyes she could not explain, a restlessness that pooled at the base of her spine. She found herself standing at the edge of the royal pastures one afternoon, her women dismissed, her linen dress clinging to her skin in the midday warmth. The bull stood at the far end of the enclosure, motionless in the golden light. It raised its head and looked at her. The Queen of Crete did not look away. What moved through her was not desire. It was something older and less reasonable. A pole that began in the base of her skull and traveled downward, settling in her bones like heat from a fire she had not lit. She told herself it was the afternoon sun. She told herself many things during those first weeks, and none of them were true. The palace noticed nothing. The king's court was occupied with tribute schedules and grain stores, with the maintenance of the fleet that made Crete the unchallenged ruler of the Aegean. Servants moved through corridors. Priests burned incense. The white bull grew heavy on the royal pastures, its horns spreading wider each season. But Pasiphae had stopped sleeping. She lay beside Minos in the great bedchamber, the frescoes of leaping dolphins pale on the walls above her, and listened to the distant sound of cattle lowing in the dark. Her skin felt foreign to her, too warm, too thin. She had begun to dread the moonrise. The curse of a god does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives as a thought that will not leave, an image that returns each time the eyes close. Pasiphae saw the bull in her mind with a clarity that terrified her. The texture of its hide, the particular curve where a horn met skull, the absolute stillness of its gaze. She understood, finally, that she was being punished. But the understanding brought no relief, only the knowledge that the punishment was not hers to refuse. Poseidon had chosen his instrument with terrible precision. What better way to wound a king than through the body of his queen? She went again to the pastures, and again, each time finding some excuse, a walk, a inspection of the sacred herd. The bull would lift its massive head when she approached. Its eyes were dark and depthless, reflecting nothing. It did not move toward her. It did not need to. The distance between them was closing on its own. The days passed. The queen grew thinner. Her women whispered that she had offended some minor deity, that an offering at the cave shrine of Aletheia might restore her. But Pasiphae knew the name of the god who had claimed her, and she knew that no offering would matter now. Minos saw nothing. He was a man who believed that walls could hold anything, a bull, a secret, a wife. He walked through his palace with the confidence of someone who had never been disobeyed by stone or sea. The altar of Poseidon remained bare, its correct sacrifice still grazing peacefully in the royal fields. And then came the night when Pasiphae awoke with the taste of salt on her lips, and knew, with a clarity that felt almost like peace, that she would do whatever was required. The curse had completed its work. It no longer felt like invasion. It felt like a part of her, the darkest part, the one that had always been waiting to be named. She rose from the bed and walked to the window. The moon was high above Mount Ida, silvering the olive groves and the distant line of the sea. Somewhere in the dark, the bull stood motionless in its enclosure. The queen of Crete pressed her palm against the cool stone and did not pray. The gods had already answered, and the answer was only beginning. Chapter 2. The Name Never Spoken. She named him for the stars. Then the dark closed in. Pasiphae came to Daedalus in the hour before dawn, when the palace slept and the corridors held only the scent of cold stone. She found him in his workshop below the eastern court, surrounded by bronze tools and half-finished designs. He did not ask why she had come. The queen's face told him everything he needed to know, and what it told him was that there was no other door left to knock on. Daedalus was an Athenian exiled to Crete, a man whose genius was matched only by his willingness to build whatever the powerful asked for. He had designed the great dance floor for Ariadne and the bronze giant Talos that guarded the island's shores. Now a queen stood before him, with a curse burning behind her eyes, asking for something that no craftsman had ever been asked to build. He worked in secret by lamplight. The thing that took shape was a hollow cow, life-sized, cypress wood planed smooth and covered with the hide of a real animal, its seams hidden beneath careful stitching. The interior was dark and close, just large enough to hold a woman. It smelled of fresh timber and old leather and something else, something like the inside of a closed mouth. When Pasiphae first saw the finished contraption, standing in the low light of the workshop, she placed her hand against its wooden flank. The grain was warm from the lamps, the hide surprisingly soft. She did not speak. Daedalus watched her from across the bench, and for the first time in his long career of building impossible things, he looked away before the queen did. They moved it at dusk. The royal pastures were empty of herders, the cattle driven to the far fields for the night. The bull stood alone in its enclosure, a pale shape in the deepening twilight, motionless as if it had been waiting. Servant Daedalus trusted, placed the hollow cow on the grass, and withdrew. Only the queen and the craftsman remained, and even he could not stay for what came next. Pasiphae stepped into the wooden shell, her body folding into the cramped darkness. The interior was smooth and warm, the wood holding the heat of the day. She heard Daedalus secure the entrance panel behind her, the sound muffled and final. Through a narrow seam in the hide, she could see the bull, a white blur in the falling dark. Her heart was not racing. It had been racing for weeks. Now it was still. The night passed. The pasture held its breath. When the first gray light touched the eastern hills, Daedalus returned to find the queen lying on the grass beside the wooden cow, her gown torn and wet with dew. She was alive. She was changed. She said nothing as he helped her to her feet, and he asked nothing in return. Some knowledge, he understood, is not meant to be held by the hands that build its container. The months that followed were heavy with silence. Pasiphae withdrew from the palace's public life, and Minos, absorbed in treaties and tribute, did not press her. The court whispered, as courts do, but the whispers found no purchase. The queen's body grew large with the weight of what the god had planted, and the god did not send a second curse. The first was already working its way toward daylight. The birth was attended only by women, midwives sworn to secrecy, their faces pale in the lamplight. What emerged was not a child in any ordinary sense, but it was a child. It breathed. It cried, not in fury, but in confusion. The sound every newborn makes. There is no need to picture the hands that caught it. It is enough to know they trembled. Its body was human at the center, and something else at the edges, as if the flesh had not yet decided what it was. The newborn's head was heavy, its brow already broad, the first curve of horns pressing beneath the thin skin of its temples. But its eyes, when they opened, dark with the memory of the womb, were not the eyes of a beast. They were the eyes of an infant, wet and unfocused, searching for a face they would never learn to recognize. No one in the room could speak. The queen reached out her hand. They cleaned the infant with water from a basin warmed over the birthroom fire, and no one spoke of what they saw. Its skin was human soft, except at the shoulders, where a fine dark down began, the texture of a young calf. Its legs, when they straightened, ended in hooves that clicked softly against the stone. The midwives wrapped it in linen and placed it in the queen's arms, and the queen did not refuse. Minos came before dawn. He stood in the doorway of the chamber, his face lit from beneath by the corridor lamp, and looked at the thing his wife held against her chest. The silence stretched. The infant stirred, its heavy head turning toward the light, and the king of Crete saw the curve of horn, the width of brow, the shape of the punishment he had earned for himself. He did not touch the child. He did not speak to his wife. He turned to Daedalus, who had been summoned and now waited in the corridor with the expression of a man who understood that his survival had just become inseparable from his silence. The king's first and only order came low and fast. Hide it. The word settled in the room like a stone dropped into deep water. But before the hiding, there was a name. Pasiphae. Her voice raw from the long night whispered it into the dark space between her mouth and the infant's brow. Asterion. Starry One. It was the name of Crete's ancient sacred king, the name that Minos' own stepfather had borne. Whether she chose it as a plea or a prophecy, no one alive could say. The name was given, and then it was never spoken again. The child was moved to a sealed chamber deep in the palace's lower levels, a room with no frescoes and no windows. For a brief time, Pasiphae visited. She held him as he grew, as his horns hardened and his body thickened, as the human softness receded and the bowl emerged. She watched his dark eyes begin to hold something that was not yet violence, but was already its shadow. Then the visit stopped. What the queen felt in those final visits, no poet recorded and no priest preserved. Perhaps she mourned. Perhaps she only catalogued the evidence of the gods' thorough work. The child who had once cried like any newborn now made sounds that resonated in the stone floor, deep vibrations that traveled through the soles of the feet before they reached the ears. He had stopped searching faces. He had learned that faces did not stay. Asterion grew alone in the dark. His only companion was the sound of his own breathing, the echo of his hooves on limestone, the distant drip of water through the palace foundations. He was fed through a slot in the wall, his meals pushed through by servants who did not look, who had been chosen for their ability to forget what their hands had just done. No voice ever spoke his name. The silence was complete. There is an old truth about creatures that grow up without kindness. They do not become monsters because they are born wrong. They become monsters because the world has shown them nothing else. The Minotaur's body had been shaped by a god's curse, but his soul, whatever fraction of it remained, was shaped by the dark, the silence, and the slot in the wall through which food came, but never hands. Years passed above ground. The palace glittered. Minos expanded his fleet, extended his treaties, fathered other children. The white bull still grazed in the royal pastures, fat and ordinary now, its divine purpose fulfilled. No one connected the creature below the palace to the king's old betrayal. The story had been buried as thoroughly as the child, and the child had become a man. The transformation was complete, and it had taken more than flesh. The creature that waited in the dark beneath Knossos was no longer Asterion in any way that the world above would recognize. But deep in the stone, in the absolute silence between breaths, something still remembered, the warmth of a hand that had once, briefly, been extended toward it. And that was the tragedy the labyrinth would be built to contain. Chapter 3. The Silence Beneath the Stone. The tribute came. The dark received it. The breathing never stopped. The sealed chamber could not hold him forever. The Minotaur grew as all living things grow steadily, indifferent to the wishes of kings. His shoulders broadened until they brushed the limestone walls. His horns hardened into pale, weathered curves that scraped the ceiling when he stood. The soft down of infancy became a coarse pelt across his upper back, dark as old charcoal. He was beautiful in the way a cliff face is beautiful, massive, unreadable, and entirely without mercy. The servants who brought his food began to hear the sounds long before they reached the door. The slow grind of horn against stone, the deep resonance of breath moving through a chest larger than any man's. They learned to set the bowls down and retreat before the hand emerged. No one had been harmed yet, but the danger was no longer theoretical. The king understood that his secret would not stay contained in a single room. Minos traveled to the sacred cave on Mount Ida, where the voice of the goddess spoke through fissures in the living rock. The oracle's words came cold and clear. The creature could not be killed. It was divine punishment, and to destroy it would invite worse. It could only be hidden. The king must build a prison from which nothing that entered could ever find its way out. The goddess did not specify whether she meant the monster or the memory. Daedalus received the commission without surprise. He had built the cow. He had kept the secret. Now the king required a third service, and the craftsman understood that his usefulness was the only thing keeping him alive. He walked alone through the lower levels of the palace, tracing the natural fissures in the bedrock, and began to sketch a design that would become the most famous prison in human memory. What he designed was not a dungeon. It was a maze without logic, a spiral that doubled back on itself, corridors that branched and branched again with no pattern a mind could hold. Every angle looked like every other. Every passage promised an exit and delivered only deeper confusion. Daedalus drew the plan on a sheet of papyrus and then destroyed it. The only copy would exist in stone, and once built, even he would struggle to find the center. The construction took years. Slaves quarried limestone from the hills above Knossos, their chisels ringing through the summer heat. Masons laid block upon block in corridors that followed no straight line. Daedalus moved among them, adjusting angles, adding false doors, carving dead ends that appeared to be thoroughfares. The labyrinth grew downward and outward beneath the palace, a second city of silence and darkness laid beneath the city of light. When the work was finished, the entrance was a simple bronze door set into the hillside below the eastern terrace. Nothing marked it as significant. No carvings, no warnings. Just a door that opened onto darkness, and beyond the darkness, 1,000 turnings that led nowhere. The first men sent in to test the design never returned. Daedalus stood at the entrance and listened to their footsteps fade, then falter, then stop. The labyrinth worked. The Minotaur was led down from his sealed chamber under heavy guard, his wrists bound with leather straps thick as a man's arm. He did not fight. He walked into the dark with the same silence he had learned in the room where his mother stopped coming. The bronze door closed behind him, and the sound of its closing echoed through the lower palace like the last word of a sentence that had taken years to speak. The creature was home, though he did not know the word. He learned the labyrinth the way a blind man learns a room by touch, by sound, by the slow accumulation of memory in the body. His hooves wore paths into the limestone. His horns left grooves in the narrow passages where he turned. He found the central chamber, a wide stone vault, directly beneath the throne room, and he made it his own. The darkness was complete. The silence was almost complete. Only the distant drip of groundwater and the sound of his own breathing kept him company. Above ground, the world continued. Minos turned his attention outward, to the tribute states that filled the Cretan treasury. When Athens' king Aegeus murdered Minos' son Androgeos in a fit of jealousy, Crete responded with overwhelming force. The Athenian fleet was broken. The city surrendered. Minos imposed a tribute that would outlast him. Every 9 years, Athens would send 7 youths and 7 maidens to Knossos, where they would enter the labyrinth and feed the thing inside. The first ship of tribute sailed from Piraeus in the autumn of the 3rd year after the war. 14 young Athenians stood on the deck, watching their city shrink into the haze. Their parents lined the harbor, and the sound that rose from the crowd was not weeping, but something older, a keening that had been practiced across generations of Greek grief. The ship's sail was black, as it would always be black, the color of a journey from which no one was expected to return. When the ship reached Crete, the tribute was marched inland from the harbor at Amnisos, past the olive groves and the cypress-lined roads, through the great western gate of Knossos. The people of the palace watched in silence. Some averted their eyes. Others looked with the clinical interest of those who have learned to call someone else's death a religious necessity. The 14 were given fresh water, clean robes of red linen, and a night to pray in a stone chamber above the labyrinth's door. At dawn, the bronze door was opened. The Athenians were led to the threshold in single file, their red robes catching the pale morning light. The darkness beyond the door was absolute, a black that seemed to drink the light from the torches the guards held. Some of the young people wept. Some had already gone silent, their faces emptied of everything except the effort of standing upright. The guards withdrew. The door closed, and the 14 were left in the dark to find their way to the thing that was already finding its way to them. The Minotaur did not hunt. That word implies pursuit, strategy, a chase through corridors that required cunning. What he did was simpler. He walked the labyrinth as he always walked it, following the sound of breathing that was not his own. The Athenians, lost within minutes, scattered by panic into dead ends and false passages, heard the slow approach of hooves on limestone. The sound came from everywhere. The labyrinth carried it, split it, bounced it off a dozen walls until direction became meaningless. There is no need to imagine what happened when the hooves stopped and the breathing grew close. The ancient sources do not linger on the details, and neither will this telling. It is enough to know that it was over quickly, and that the labyrinth, for months afterward, held the faint copper scent of what had been offered. When the bronze door was opened again 9 years later for the second tribute, the central chamber held only bones, red linen scraps, and the patient, waiting shape of the creature who had learned to live alone. The tribute became a rhythm. Every 9 years, the black sail appeared on the horizon, and the people of Knossos remembered that their king kept a god's punishment beneath their feet. The Minotaur grew immense on the steady offering of young bodies. His shoulders thickened to the width of a bowl in its prime. His horns spread wide enough that some corridors became impassable to him. His eyes, when glimpsed by the brief light of a dropped torch, had gone distant, and still, the eyes of a creature who no longer expected to see anything worth recognizing. Around the labyrinth, an ecology of fear developed. Priests established a small shrine above the entrance, where incense was burned continuously to mask the smell that rose from below. Guards were rotated monthly because no man could stand watch beside the bronze door for longer without beginning to dream of hooves. Locals claimed that on still nights, if you pressed your ear to the limestone at the base of the eastern terrace, you could hear the Minotaur breathing a slow, tidal rhythm that seemed to move the stone itself. The creature did not hate his victims. He did not know them. They were warmth and sound, and then they were silence. He had no language for cruelty, no framework for malice. He was an appetite, shaped by divine punishment and years of darkness, doing what his body had been designed to do. The tragedy was not that he was evil. The tragedy was that he had been made to do evil, and had never been given the choice to be anything else. In Athens, the tribute was a wound that did not close. Every 9 years, the city drew lots to choose its offering. Mothers whose children were selected wore mourning for a year before the ship even sailed. The king, Aegeus, grew old under the weight of his city's grief, his rule hollowed by the knowledge that his own jealous crime had brought this punishment down on his people. When his son Theseus grew to manhood, the prince found a city that had been waiting for a hero longer than it could remember. But before any hero could descend, the creature simply waited. The labyrinth held him in its stone arms. The tribute came. The tribute ended. The bones joined the bones. And in the central chamber, beneath the throne room where Minos held court, the Minotaur stood in the absolute dark and breathed. And the sound of his breathing was the sound of a story that had not yet found its ending. Chapter 4. The Gift in Secret. She brought him thread and a luminous crown. She did not tremble. The third tribute was gathering in Athens when Theseus returned from Trozen, a young prince who had spent his childhood away from the city whose throne he would inherit. He walked through the agora and saw the lots being drawn, the black stones that meant a name had been chosen. He heard the sound the mothers made, a keening he had never heard before, in which he would never forget. He was the son of Aegeus, or so the world believed. Some whispered that his true father was Poseidon, that the sea god had visited his mother Aethra on the same night the king had. Theseus did not know which bloodline was true, and he had spent his young life trying to prove himself worthy of either. A hero does not wait for certainty. A hero acts, and lets the gods decide afterward whose son he was. He went to his father in the palace on the Acropolis, and told him he would sail with the tribute. Aegeus, old and hollowed by years of grief, begged him to stay. The king had already lost one son to Crete's curse, Androgeus, whose murder had started the war. He could not lose another. But Theseus was not asking permission. He was telling his father what would happen. And what would happen was that Athens would send no more children into the dark. The ship sailed from Piraeus with the black sail raised, as the tribute always sailed. 14 young Athenians, in red linen robes, stood on the deck, and among them stood the prince, dressed as they were, indistinguishable except for the set of his jaw. He carried a sword beneath his robe, a blade of simple bronze that his mother's father had given him. He did not yet know if it would be enough. He knew only that he would find out. The voyage took 3 days across the Aegean, the sea shifting from gray to deep sapphire as they left the Attic coast behind. The tribute did not speak much. Some of them prayed. Some of them stared at the water and thought of their mothers. Theseus walked among them, learning their names, memorizing their faces. He had not come to die. He had come to make sure that no one else died after him. When the ship rounded the eastern cape of Crete, and the palace of Knossos rose into view, white walls blazing against the deep blue sky, red columns catching the midday sun, the Athenians fell silent. The palace was larger than anything they had imagined, a sprawl of terraces and staircases that seemed to grow out of the limestone itself. It was beautiful, and beneath it, they all knew, something waited that was not beautiful at all. Minos received them in the great courtyard, surrounded by his guards and his courtiers, his crimson robes pooling at his feet. He looked at the 14 young Athenians with the flat appraisal of a man who had been receiving such shipments for 2 decades. But when his eyes fell on Theseus, something shifted. The prince did not lower his gaze. The king asked who he was. Theseus gave his name and his lineage, and Minos understood that this tribute would not go like the others. Above the courtyard, on a high terrace shaded by a linen awning, Princess Ariadne stood watching. She was the daughter of Minos and Pasiphae, raised in the palace whose foundations held her half-brother. She had grown up hearing the sounds that rose through the stone at night. She had watched the tribute arrive every 9 years and had learned to turn her face away. But today, she did not turn away. Today, she saw the young man who had refused to lower his eyes. She came to him that night in the chamber where the Athenians were being held, the guards dismissed with a word from the princess they dared not disobey. She was young and dark-haired, her gown the deep marine blue of the Cretan sea. In her hands, she carried 2 things. The first was a simple ball of crimson thread wound tight around a spool of olive wood. The second was a crown of pale gold that glowed faintly in the lamplight, a gift from the gods to her mother on her wedding day. She told him what the thread was for. Tie it to the entrance stone and let it unspool behind you as you walk. The labyrinth has no logic, no landmarks, no light, but the thread will remember when the thing is dead, follow the thread back. She did not say if, she said when, and her voice was steady, and her hands, when she pressed the thread into his palm, did not tremble. There is something unbearable about a gift given in secret, against one's own blood. It carries a weight that cannot be repaid. When Ariadne left, the chamber felt colder. Theseus sat alone with the thread and the crown, the lamplight pooling on the worn stone floor. The thread was ordinary wool, dyed deep crimson, the kind a weaver might use for a ceremonial robe. The crown was not ordinary. It held a faint luminescence, pale gold, the color of stars just before they break through the dusk. He placed it on his head, and the light pushed gently against the darkness. The other Athenians slept fitfully, their dreams filled with hooves and stone and the absence of sky. Theseus did not sleep. He sat with his back against the wall and thought about the path ahead. Not the labyrinth's path, which he could not know, but the path that had brought him here, the childhood in Troezen, the heavy weight of his father's name, the faces of the mothers in the agora. He had promised them, without speaking, that their children would come home. Dawn came cold and gray, the light filtering through the high window like water through old cloth. Guards arrived with torches and bronze swords, their faces set in the practiced blankness of men who had done this before. The Athenians rose. Some wept quietly. One girl, younger than the rest, pressed her palm against the stone wall as if memorizing its texture. Theseus gathered them around him and told them to stay close, to follow the sound of his voice, and to trust the thread. The procession to the labyrinth entrance wound through the lower terraces of the palace, past storerooms and oil presses, and the great workshops where artisans painted vessels with octopi and sacred bowls. The morning was pale gold, the sea visible in glimpses between cypress trees. The small shrine above the bronze door was already sending up its thin ribbon of juniper smoke. A priest in dark blue robes
At the threshold,
watched them approach. The bronze door
his face
stood closed,
unreadable,
its surface dark burner swinging gently in the still air. The 14 Athenians gathered in a tight cluster, their red robes stirring in the sea breeze. Some of the guards averted their eyes. One of the younger tributes, a boy of perhaps 14, began to tremble so violently that the girl beside him took his hand. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say that the stone and the silence had not already said. Theseus removed the spool of crimson thread from beneath his robe and knelt at the entrance stone. He looped the end around a worn iron ring set into the limestone, pulling the knot tight. His hands were steady. The thread caught the pale morning light, a single line of red against the gray stone, and he let it unspool a short length across the ground. It lay there, like a vein opened carefully, the only path back to the world of the living. The guards pulled the bronze door open. The darkness beyond was not the darkness of night, which yields to starlight. It was the darkness of depth, of weight, of a place that had never known the sun. The air that spilled out was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of old copper and limestone dust. The Athenians behind Theseus drew back as one, a collective intake of breath. The darkness seemed to breathe back. Theseus turned once and looked up at the high terrace where he had seen Ariadne watching the day before. She was there now, a pale figure against the deep blue of the morning sky, her hand raised, but not waving. She stood perfectly still, as if any movement might break something fragile. He did not call out to her. He raised his hand once, a brief acknowledgement, and then he turned back to the dark. The luminous crown on his brow began to glow more brightly. He stepped across the threshold. The crimson thread unspooled behind him, catching the last of the daylight before the dark swallowed it. One by one, the other Athenians followed, their hands touching the thread, their breaths shallow and quick. The bronze door did not close immediately. For a long moment, a rectangle of golden light lay across the stone floor of the entrance corridor, and within that light, the thread glowed like a promise. Then the guards pushed the door shut, and the light was gone. The only illumination was the faint gold of Ariadne's crown and the feel of the thread between their fingers. Ahead, the darkness stretched into 1,000 turnings. Behind them, the bronze door had no handle on the inside. Theseus drew his grandfather's sword and began to walk. The labyrinth received them as it had received everyone, and the silence closed over their breathing like water over a stone. Chapter 5. The Last Breath in the Dark. He did not roar. He released a breath held since birth. The dark of the labyrinth was not empty. It was full. Full of the sound of 14 people breathing. Full of the scuff of sandals on limestone. Full of the thin, constant whisper of the crimson thread unspooling from the spool in Theseus's hand. The luminous crown on his brow pushed a pale gold circle into the black, just enough light to see the walls on either side and the darkness ahead that had no end. The walls were dressed limestone, smooth in some places and rough in others, marked here and there by the passage of something large that had scraped against the stone. The air was cool and dry, and it tasted of dust. The thread ran behind them, a single red line connecting them to a door they could no longer see. Somewhere in the silence ahead, water dripped with the regularity of a heartbeat. Theseus led, his bronze sword held low. Behind him, the 13 Athenians walked in single file, each with one hand on the thread and the other touching the shoulder of the person ahead. No one spoke. The only sounds were their feet. their breath, and a thread. The labyrinth turned left, then right, then left again, then split into 3 passages. And at each junction, Theseus paused, listened, and chose. He did not know the way. There was no way to know. But he had learned in his years of walking toward danger that hesitation killed more surely than a wrong turn. He moved with the steady confidence of someone who had decided, long before entering, that he would either find the center or die seeking it. The thread would bring him back. The sword would do the rest. The corridors narrowed. The walls grew rougher. The marks deeper. Long grooves carved into the stone at the height of a man's shoulders. Grooves that could only have been made by horns. The air grew warmer, heavier, carrying a scent that was not dust. The Athenians behind Theseus began to falter. He stopped and turned to them. "Stay here," he told them. "Hold the thread. Do not let go. If I do not return, follow it back and pray the door opens." They did not argue. They were beyond arguing. They huddled together in the narrow corridor, their red robes dark as old blood in the faint light of the crown, their hands clutching the thread as if it were the only solid thing in the world. Theseus looked at each of their faces, memorizing them in case this was the last time, and then he turned and walked alone into the deeper dark. The passage opened into a wider chamber, and the crown's light fell on what the labyrinth had been keeping. Bones lay scattered across the stone floor, cleaned of everything that had once made them human. Skulls rested against the walls. Scraps of red linen, faded to the color of dried roses, clung to rib cages and pelvises. Some of the dead had been arranged, unintentionally, into patterns that suggested they had crawled toward each other before the end. Theseus stopped at the chamber's edge. He looked at the bones. He looked for a long time. Then he stepped past them, his sandals careful on the stone, and continued forward. The Minotaur's breathing reached him before anything else. A deep, slow rhythm that resonated through the floor. The sound so low it was felt in the chest before it was heard in the ears. The creature was close. The central vault opened around him like a wound in the earth. It was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness, its walls curving upward into shadow. The crown's light could not reach the edges, and in the center of the vault, standing motionless, as if it had been waiting since the world began, was the Minotaur. He was larger than Theseus had imagined. His horns swept wide and pale. His dark eyes reflected the crown's light like twin pools of still water. He did not charge. He simply stood and breathed and watched the hero enter. There is a moment that comes in every confrontation where both parties understand what is about to happen. It arrived in the silence between them. The Minotaur had never been given language, but he understood threat. Theseus had never faced a creature like this, but he understood duty. Neither of them wanted to be here. Both of them had been brought to this vault by forces they could not control. And then the moment passed, and the Minotaur lowered his head, and Theseus raised his sword. The Minotaur came forward not in a charge, but in a surge. A mass of muscle and horn and shadow resolving out of the dark. The sound of his hooves on the limestone was not the frantic pounding of a frightened animal. It was heavy and deliberate. The beat of a creature who had never learned to run because nothing in his domain had ever required him to. He closed the distance with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Theseus stepped into the attack rather than away from it, slipping to the side as the horn swept past him, close enough that he felt the wind of their passing. The bronze sword struck once across the creature's shoulder, opening a dark line in the coarse hide. The Minotaur made no sound of pain. The blow that came in return was not a fist, but a forearm as thick as a temple column, and it caught Theseus across the chest and sent him sprawling across the stone. The crown of Ariadne rolled from his brow, its pale gold light spinning across the walls as it tumbled, coming to rest against the far curve of the vault. The darkness rushed back in. Theseus lay on his back. The breath knocked from his lungs. the sword still in his grip. In the absolute black, he heard the hooves turn, slow and certain, and begin to come toward him again. He rolled. The horn struck the stone where his chest had been a heartbeat before. He found his feet and his club in the same motion, the heavy olive wood shaft his grandfather had given him fitting into his left hand. The next time the Minotaur came forward, Theseus did not retreat. He swung the club upward and caught the creature beneath the jaw, snapping the heavy head back. The sound of the blow echoed through the vault. For a moment, the creature stumbled. For a moment, he was simply an animal that had been hurt and did not understand why. Theseus did not hesitate. The sword found the place beneath the ribs where the hide was thinnest, where the pulse beat close to the surface. He drove the blade home with both hands. The Minotaur's body went rigid, every muscle locking against the wound. A sound escaped him, not a roar, not a bellow, but something smaller, something closer to a breath released after being held too long. Then his legs buckled, and the great weight of him came down upon the stone. The fighting was over, but the dying took longer. The Minotaur lay on his side, his massive chest rising and falling with breaths that grew slower and further apart. His dark eyes were open, fixed on nothing, reflecting the pale gold glow of the crown across the chamber. Theseus knelt nearby, his own breath ragged, his hands slick with blood and dust. He did not speak. There were no words for what had just ended, and he understood that words would have been the wrong offering. The creature's breathing slowed to a rhythm like the tide going out. Each exhale was longer than the last. The silence between breaths stretched. Theseus watched the great bull's head settle against the limestone, the horns coming to rest on the floor that had been worn smooth by years of pacing. In the distant past of the Labyrinth, a hand had once reached toward this creature, a mother's hand, trembling in the dark. Now another hand, steadier but no less weighted, reached out and rested briefly on the coarse hide of the shoulder. There is no need to linger on the final breath. It came, and then the Labyrinth heard something it had never heard before. Complete silence. No hooves, no breathing, no heartbeat. The central vault, which had been a place of life for longer than anyone above ground knew, became a place of something else. The bones of the dead kept their vigil. The crown kept its glow. And the Minotaur, who had been born Asterion, lay still. Theseus retrieved the luminous crown and placed it back upon his brow. He stood over the body for a long moment, his sword hanging loose in his grip, his expression unreadable. He had done what he came to do. The tribute would end. Athens would be free. But something in the silence told him that this victory was not the kind that ends cleanly, that the weight of what lay at his feet would follow him out of the labyrinth and into every year of his life that remained. He turned from the body and began to walk. The crimson thread appeared at the edge of the crown's glow, a thin red line leading back toward the living. He followed it through the bone chamber, through the narrowing corridors, past the grooves of horns that would never mark the stone again. Behind him, the labyrinth held its new silence. Ahead, 13 Athenians clutched a thread and waited. The dark was still deep, but it no longer breathed. Chapter 6. The thread unwound. The hero returned. The princess was left. The sea took its king. The crimson thread led them back through every turning, taut and certain in the dark. Theseus walked at the rear now, the luminous crown upon his brow. The 13 Athenians ahead of him, with their hands still clutching the line that had not broken. No one spoke. The only sound was the scuff of sandals and the unspooling of breath held too long. The thread led them upward, and the dark began to soften from black to gray. When the bronze door opened, the daylight was blinding. It fell upon their faces like a blow that did not hurt. A white gold flood that spilled across the threshold and into the labyrinth's mouth as if the sun itself had been waiting. The Athenians stumbled into the morning, their red robes bright as fresh blood against the pale limestone, their eyes streaming, their chests heaving, with the first clean air they had tasted since the door had closed. The guards at the entrance fell back in astonishment. One dropped his spear. The priest at the shrine let his incense burner swing on its chain, the juniper smoke drifting unheeded into the morning sky. From the high terraces of the palace, servants and courtiers began to gather, their faces moving from confusion to dawning recognition. The tribute had gone in. The tribute had come out. And at their head walked a prince who had been counted among the dead. Theseus untied the thread from the iron ring at the entrance stone. The knot came loose easily, as if the stone itself were releasing its hold. He wound the crimson line around the olive wood spool with slow, deliberate care, his hand still marked by the dark of the vault. The thread was intact, every span of it. He tucked it into the fold of his robe and looked up at the high terrace where Ariadne had stood the morning before. She was gone. She found him before the hour was out, in the lower court where the Athenians were being given water and bread by servants who did not yet understand that the ritual had been broken. Her marine blue gown was the same, but her face had changed the stillness of a woman who had committed treason and knew it could not be undone. She did not ask if the creature was dead. She saw the answer in the set of his shoulders. She asked only when they would sail, and he told her, now. The escape from Knossos was swift and silent. Ariadne led them to the harbor at Amnisos by paths that only the palace women knew, through olive groves still gray with pre-dawn shadow. The Cretan fleet rode at anchor in the bay, their hulls dark against the silver water. But no alarm had been raised. The black-sailed Athenian ship still waited at the quay, crewed by the same sailors who had wept when the tribute disembarked. They wept again now, in disbelief. The ship slipped out of the harbor with the first tide, its black sail raised against a sky of soft rose and pearl. Ariadne stood at the stern, watching the palace of Knossos recede into the morning haze. She had been a princess. She was now something else, a woman who had chosen a stranger's life over her father's blood. She did not look away until the island was a gray smudge on the horizon. And then she turned her face toward Athens. The voyage back was not the same as the voyage out. The Athenians sang, some of them, the old hymns of thanks to Apollo and Artemis. Others slept for the first time in days, their bodies finally surrendering the tension that had held them upright. Theseus moved among them, his hand touching a shoulder here, a head there, but his eyes were distant. Something was already turning in him, the knowledge that victory and its aftermath are not the same thing. They put in at Naxos to resupply, the island rising from the sea in a sweep of white cliffs and dark cypress. The Athenians went ashore to gather water and fresh provisions. Ariadne walked apart from them, along a beach of pale sand where the waves broke in gentle sheets of turquoise and white. She was tired. She had not slept. She lay down in the shade of an ancient olive tree. Her marine blue gown spread around her like a pool of dark water, and she closed her eyes. When she woke, the ship was gone. The black sail was a dark speck on the horizon, shrinking into the deep blue of the open sea. She stood at the water's edge, the waves washing over her bare feet, and she did not call out. There is a particular stillness that comes when you understand that the person who owed you everything has chosen to leave you behind. She stood in that stillness for a long time, and the sea said nothing, and the sky offered no explanation. The myths disagree on why Theseus left her. Some say a god commanded it, Dionysus, who had seen the princess from Olympus and wanted her for himself. Some say Theseus simply forgot her in the rush of escape. Some say he made a choice, cold and clean, that a princess who betrayed her own father could not be trusted in the bed of a future king. The reason matters less than the fact. She was left. The ship sailed, and the black sail, which should have been changed to white, remained black against the sky. In Crete, Minos discovered the betrayal. The labyrinth was silent. The tribute was gone. His daughter was gone. The king's rage held in check for 3 decades by the careful architecture of his rule, finally broke its seals. He turned on the one man whose usefulness had run out. Daedalus was seized in his workshop, dragged past the benches where he had built the wooden cow and drawn the plans for the labyrinth, and thrown into the prison he himself had designed. The craftsman who had built the inescapable maze now stood at its center, in the same vault where the Minotaur had breathed his last. The bones of the dead were still there. The air still held the faint copper scent of old offerings. But Daedalus was not defeated. He walked the corridors he knew better than any living soul, gathering the feathers of birds that had found their way into the upper passages, collecting the wax strippings from old torches. A prison built by its own architect is not a prison. It is a workshop. He built 2 pairs of wings, one for himself, one for his son Icarus, a boy who had grown up in the shadow of his father's genius and his father's crimes. He lashed the feathers with thread and sealed them with wax, working in the cold light of the high fissure. When the wings were finished, he strapped them to his son's shoulders and told him the only rule that mattered: fly neither too low, where the sea's damp would weigh the feathers down, nor too high, where the sun's heat would melt the wax. They took flight from the hillside above Knossos, 2 figures rising against the pale morning sky, their wings beating with a rhythm no human had ever matched. The palace fell away beneath them. The sea stretched before them, a sheet of hammered sapphire. For one long, impossible hour, Daedalus flew free, the first man to escape Crete's reach. And then Icarus, young and drunk on the sky, began to climb. The wax softened. The feathers scattered. The boy fell, a white speck tumbling into the blue, and the sea received him without ceremony. Daedalus flew on alone. He carried the weight of his son's fall into every year that remained, a grief that settled into his bones like cold wax hardening. He landed in Sicily, where he would live out his days, building wonders for a new king. Minos pursued him, sailing west with the fleet that had once ruled the Aegean. But the king's luck had turned. He died in Sicily, murdered in a bath by the daughters of a rival ruler. The man who had hidden his shame beneath a palace never saw his kingdom again. In Athens, King Aegeus had been keeping vigil at Cape Sunion since the black sail disappeared over the southern horizon. Every morning he climbed to the temple of Poseidon at the cliff's edge, his old eyes straining across the water. He had promised Theseus on the day of departure that the ship would carry a white sail if the prince lived, a signal visible from miles away, a father's reprieve before the harbor was reached. Theseus, in the exhaustion of escape and the chaos of Ariadne's abandonment, had forgotten to change the sail. The black sail appeared on the horizon. Aegeus saw it from the cliff, a dark spot against the brilliant blue, and he understood what it meant. Or he misunderstood, which is its own kind of understanding. He did not wait for the ship to reach the shore. He stepped from the cliff's edge at Sonion, his royal cloak catching the wind, and the sea that bears his name, the Aegean, received him as it had received so many others. The splash was small against the rocks. The waves closed over him and smoothed themselves flat. Theseus returned to Athens, a hero and an orphan, on the same tide. He walked into his father's palace and found it draped in mourning. The city that should have celebrated him was burying its king. The prince who had slain the Minotaur became the king who had killed his father, not by the sword, but by the same forgetfulness that had left Ariadne sleeping on the sand. The thread that saved his life could not undo the knots his neglect had tied around everyone who loved him. The luminous crown of Ariadne did not die. Dionysus found her on Naxos, the story says, and made her his immortal bride. And when she died, he took the crown from her brow and placed it among the stars. It rises still, the constellation Corona Borealis, a pale gold arc in the northern sky, visible from Crete and Naxos and Athens alike. It is the last trace of the Minotaur story, and it belongs entirely to the princess who dared, for a moment, to love the right thing at the wrong cost. Every night, The stars remember what the hero forgot. Chapter 7. What the name outlasted. He was called Starry One. The stars have not forgotten. The ancient Greeks who told this story understood something about it that we often forget. They did not see the Minotaur as a villain. They saw him as evidence proof that the sins of the powerful do not vanish, that they take flesh and walk, that they must be fed. The creature beneath the palace was not the crime. He was the crime's consequence. And the Greeks knew the difference. For classical Athens, the Minotaur was a political symbol. He was what happened when a tyrant defied the gods and refused to sacrifice what he owed. Minos was not a monster, but he made one. The Labyrinth was not a dungeon, but a kingdom's shame given architectural form. Every 9 years, when the black sail appeared on the horizon, Athens remembered that power without piety produces creatures that consume the innocent. And for Crete, the story was different. The island that produced the bull-leaping frescoes, that carved the double axe into every sacred stone, that worshipped the bull as the embodiment of divine potency. That island told a version of the myth that did not end in a hero's triumph. The Cretans, Pausanias recorded, denied the Minotaur was ever a monster at all. They said he was a general, a man named Asterion, imprisoned by palace politics and slandered by Athenian propaganda. The name matters. Asterion, Starry One, was not a name given lightly. It belonged to the ancient sacred king of Crete, the man who raised Europa's divine sons after Zeus abandoned her. It belonged to the constellation Taurus, the bull whose stars the Minoans watched from their mountain shrines. A name that means of the stars, given to a child who was sealed underground before he could ever see them. The cruelty is not in the naming. The cruelty is in everything that followed. When the archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated Knossos in the early 20th century, he found a palace that seemed to have been built by a civilization obsessed with bulls. Frescoes of bull-leaping acrobats, horns of consecration carved from alabaster, Rhyton vessels shaped like bulls' heads with eyes of rock crystal and shell. The double-axe symbol, the Labyrinth, appeared on every wall, every pillar, every sacred object. Evans named the civilization Minoan after the king, and he understood immediately that the labyrinth had been real. The Palace of Knossos was not a single building, but a complex of over 1,000 rooms, spread across 5 acres, corridors branching into corridors, staircases descending into storerooms, light wells opening unexpectedly onto courtyards. To a visitor from the Greek mainland, accustomed to the simple megaron halls of Mycenae, Knossos would have felt like a maze. The labyrinth of myth may have been the palace itself, the labyrinth its sacred sign, the house of the double axe, slowly becoming the prison of the bull. There is an older layer still beneath the palace and the myth. Some scholars suggest that the Minotaur was not a monster degraded from a man, but a god degraded from worship. The bull was the Minoans' most sacred animal, the beast they leaped over in ecstatic ritual, the form Zeus took to carry Europa across the sea. If the Minotaur was Asterion, and Asterion was a sacred king, then what the Greek myth records is the moment an old god was locked underground and called a monster by the people who had stopped believing in him. The labyrinth, in this reading, was not a prison. It was a temple. The winding corridors were not designed to confuse, but to initiate a chthonic journey into the dark, where the old gods lived, where the supplicant died and was reborn. The labyrinth was the axe of sacrifice. The bull at the center was not a beast to be slain, but a presence to be encountered. The myth of Theseus and the Minotaur may be the memory, distorted across centuries, of the last time someone entered the sacred maze and killed the god inside it. We cannot know if this is true. The Minoans left no histories, only frescoes and foundations, and the silent stones of their shrines. But the pattern holds across cultures. Old gods become demons. Old rituals become crimes. Old temples become haunted places where heroes go to prove themselves. The Minotaur may be one of those gods, the sacred bull of a civilization that vanished, remembered only as a monster by the people who came after and no longer understood what they were looking at. And yet, for all the scholarship and the excavation and the careful weighing of sources, something simpler and sadder remains. The Minotaur was a child. He was given a name and then hidden from the sky that name belonged to. He grew up in darkness, fed through a slot in the wall, and when he died in the only place he had ever known. The Greeks built a hero out of his death. The archaeologists built a museum out of his home. But the child named Asterion, he never saw the stars. That is the fact that lingers longest. What the Greeks took from the Minotaur was a lesson about pride. What the modern world took was something else. The creature in the maze became the face of every fear we carry about the thing that might be waiting in our own depths. The appetite we cannot control, the rage we did not choose, the part of ourselves we have locked underground and fed with silence. The Minotaur is no longer just a myth. He is a mirror. In psychology, the labyrinth became a symbol of the unconscious, the winding, lightless passages of the mind where old wounds pace and breathe. In literature, Borges imagined a Minotaur who welcomed death as a release from a life of lonely incomprehension. In art, Picasso drew him as a bull of war, a beast of blind violence, and later as a creature of pathos. His great head bowed under the weight of a sorrow that had no name. Each generation finds its own Minotaur, and each generation finds the same one waiting. The Athenian tribute, 7 youths and 7 maidens every 9 years, was, in the historical record, likely a memory of something real. Minoan Crete was a naval power that dominated the Aegean for centuries, and mainland cities like Athens may well have sent offerings, hostages, or ritual participants to Knossos. The bull leaping depicted in the frescoes was dangerous and sacred, and the young acrobats who performed it may have been sent as tribute. The line between ritual offering and human sacrifice is thin and easily blurred by centuries of retelling. The death of the Minotaur marked more than the end of a monster. It marked the end of Crete's dominance. The myth tells us that after Theseus sailed away, Minos pursued Daedalus to Sicily and died there, murdered in a foreign bath. The great thalassocracy crumbled. The palaces fell. The Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, the people who told the story of Theseus, inherited the Aegean. The Minotaur's death was, in the symbolic language of myth, the death of Minoan civilization itself. And yet, the bull survived. The constellation Taurus rises every autumn and crosses the winter sky. The same stars the Minoans watched from the peak sanctuaries of Mount Ida. The name Asterion, which meant Starry One, is still spoken not in prayer, but in scholarship, in poetry, in the quiet moments when someone learns that the Minotaur had a name and stops for a moment to consider what that means. A name outlasts a prison. A name outlasts a king. The excavations at Knossos continue. The palace still yields its secrets. A tablet here, a seal stone there, the buried bones of offerings that were not human but bovine, the horns of bulls sacrificed to a god whose name we do not know. The labyrinth's true location remains uncertain, but the limestone corridors beneath the palace are real, and some of them are still unexplored, collapsed by earthquakes and the weight of 3,000 years. The darkness that held Asterion may still exist, sealed and silent beneath the tourist's feet. There is a quieter truth beneath all the history and the archaeology and the literary illusion. It is this: a child was born into shame that was not his own. He was hidden. He was fed. He was killed. And the world that did this to him called him a monster and celebrated his death as a victory. The Greeks understood that this was tragedy, not triumph. That is why they named him, and why the name carries the stars he never saw. If you stand today at the ruins of Knossos on a clear autumn night, the constellation Taurus rises over Mount Ida, just as it rose when the palace was alive with torchlight and bull leaping. Corona Borealis, Ariadne's crown, arcs across the northern sky. And if you press your ear to the limestone at the base of the eastern terrace, though, there is no need to do this literally, only to imagine it. You might hear, in the deep vibration of the earth, the echo of a breathing that has stopped. The silence that replaced it has lasted 3,000 years. The Minotaur was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a consequence, the shape that divine anger takes when it enters the world and must be fed. But he was also a child, and he was named, and the name meant Starry One. And that name is the only part of him that no sword could reach. It is still there, written in the oldest texts, spoken in the quietest rooms, waiting in the dark like the first light of a constellation that is not yet risen. There is a reason you have listened to this story for 7 chapters, and the reason is not that you wanted to understand a monster. It is that you recognized, somewhere beneath the myth and the archaeology and the centuries of retelling, that this was never a monster at all. It was a memory of a god, of a king, of a child who never asked to be born. And the labyrinth, which was built to contain him, could not contain his name. Asterion, Starry One. The stars remember. You might too.